So in this video, I'm going to make some cutting boards, and I want to show you how to make your cutting boards more efficiently. Now, I'm just going to make 3 here, okay? But you could take the same idea and you can multiply it. And I'm going to have 3 different styles of cutting boards that are the same style. And what I mean by that is that I'm going to use the same pattern in all of them, but I'm going to mix my materials up. Now, I got 3 materials I'm going to work with here. I've got maple, cherry, and walnut. Essentially what we're doing is we're doing woodworking in assembly line process. And like I said, I'm only going to do 3, but as you see me do these 3, you'll be able to see how you multiply this process. Instead of doing 3 at a time, do 6 at a time, do 12 at a time, and get your cutting boards made more efficiently so that you've got the cutting boards to take to that show, and you can sell them at a price where people are willing to buy them and still feel like you're making some money at it. So let's get started and make some sawdust. Okay, so the first thing I've done here is cut my lumber down to 4-foot lengths. Why 4 feet? Well, it's a good, easy size to handle. I can run 6-foot or maybe 7-foot material through my planer where it's sitting. It's just a hassle, okay? 4 feet's long enough, it'll go through the planer well. It's short enough, it's easy to work with. So I've chosen 4 feet. But there's another reason for it too. Most people think of a cutting board as being 1 foot by 2 feet. Okay, that's a pretty good size. Really, they're usually about, say, 11 3/4 by 22 inches long. They're not quite 2 feet. Now, one of the things you want to do whenever you're doing an edge grain glue up is you want to cut it oversized. In other words, your rough cut, you want it to be oversized so that you can then cut it down to size. So I'm actually going to make these things 23 or 24 inches long to end up with a 22-inch size. That way when I trim the ends, I can get it down to exactly that 22 inches, okay? So I'll probably actually make them 23 inches, which means I'll have a little bit of scrap there, but it's worth having that little bit of scrap to make sure it works out. Now I've got a bit of an issue here in that not all my boards are the same width, okay? You notice I've got a nice wide piece of maple here. This is 7.5 inches wide. I've got a piece of cherry here at 7.5 inches wide, but this one's only 5.5 inches wide. The other thing I've got my piece of walnut that I'm working with is really not that great. It's 5.5 inches wide, but I've got some rough surface here where it's been cut, but it hasn't been sanded well. This is rough cut lumber, okay? And then I also have a little bit of wane. And the main reason I'm using this particular piece of lumber is I found that the other walnut I've got, most of it is bowed, and it came from the supplier that way. It wasn't the best material. So what I'm going to have to do with the cherry and the maple is put 2 pieces together to get my 11 3/4 inch or 12 inch width. With my walnut, I'm actually going to have to go 3 pieces, and to get those 3 pieces is going to be a little tricky because here where the wane is, I can't even get 5.5 inches of width, and here I've got a knot hole to deal with. So I'm actually going to be piecing it together a bit. Doesn't really affect overall what I'm doing, but it is an issue that I got to deal with, okay? Whenever you're dealing with lumber, especially with hardwood lumber that comes from a hardwood lumber supplier, you've got to count on those sort of things happening. All right, so I've cut it to this 4-foot length. It's workable. Now I want to run it through the planer. Now, one of the nice things about long grain cutting boards compared to end grain cutting boards is thickness. You use a lot less material making long grain cutting boards. End grain cutting boards are typically 1.5 inches thick, which means you're starting out with material that's, say, 1 3/4 inches, or maybe because of availability, you're starting out with 4-4 lumber, okay? That's twice as much lumber as if you're doing long grain. Long grain, we start off with 4-4 or sanded 4 sides, so 3/4. By the time we get done, we're down to about 5/8 of an inch thick. That's still okay, all right, because it's long grain. I've got cutting boards in there that are less than 1/2 inch thick, but because they're long grain, it works out. So we save ourselves some money by going with long grain. And most of the customers aren't really going to notice that unless there's somebody that's looking for that, big beefy cutting board that's willing to pay for the thicker end grain cutting board. So next thing I'm going to do is plane these to get them exactly the same thickness, and also to get rid of these rough areas on my piece of walnut. Before I can glue the boards together and make it into something wide enough to be a cutting board, I've got to make sure I've got a clean edge or clean edges for gluing. That's normally done on a jointer. Unfortunately, I don't have a working jointer here in the shop. I either do it with a hand plane, or most of the time I do it on my table saw. Fortunately, my table saw, it runs true enough that I get a really clean cut. I don't have a lot of blade marks, and I don't have problems with the saw giving me a wavy cut in any way, shape, or form. Now, most of the lumber I'm working with is what's known as S3S, which stands for sanded three sides. That means that the two surfaces and one edge come from wherever I got it from, clean, sanded, true, okay? The other side is still rough sawn, so really that's the side I've got to be concerned with. Now, I've already taken these boards and set them on edge on my workbench top, which I know is flat, to make sure I didn't have any bow in them. If I bow, I'd have to trim both sides, but because I don't have bow, at least, for example, on this board, I only have to trim the one side. Now, my walnut, that's another story. We'll talk about that in a moment, okay? So really all I'm going to do is trim off just a little bit off this one edge, and I'm going to try and cut the least amount possible so I don't waste material and give myself a clean edge that I can glue, okay? Now, I have to do this individually for each board because the boards are different widths, but that's okay. Okay, I don't know if you noticed what just happened, but I set my fence up for the width of the board at this end, and I started cutting it, and as I cut it, I got to a point where it wasn't cutting anymore. And the reason wasn't because the board is warped, it's because the board is of an inconsistent width. It's actually wider at this end than it is at this end, okay? So that can happen. That's part of what happens when you buy lumber, hardwood lumber from a hardwood supplier that hasn't been sanded four sides, okay? So I'm flipping it around, and I'm going to do it again from the other side, and I'm going to end up with actually a tapered strip coming off this board. So there's my tapered strip. It was actually just uneven on one end. Most of the length of the board it was consistent with, but for some reason when I cut this at the sawmill, we ended up with one end that was a little bit wider. Well, we just took care of that problem. So here's one of my pieces of walnut. This is the one that's got the wane. Turns out it's got a bit of a bow in it as well. So I've got another board here that I know is straight, and this is just a piece of select grade pine, but it's straight. That's what matters, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and stick it on here using double-sided tape. So that gives me a very straight edge put up against my fence. And I've just barely got it hanging off the end here, the edge of this piece of walnut, but that's all I needed to do, okay? Now what I need to do is I need to set my blade, so I'm going to cut right about here where the edge of that wane is, and that's the tricky part. So first I'm going to bring my blade in to flush, and then I want to bring it over about another 7/8 of an inch. So that should put us at right about the spot I need to be, I hope. So once I make one side straight, I can use that straight side against the fence so I can make the other side straight. And I end up with a chunk of wood. Yeah, I've lost a little bit of my material, but I've got something that I can use. Okay, so I've got my boards here. They're all planed to the same thickness, and but you notice they're not all the same width. Now that's what happens when you buy a hardwood. It's not like going and buying 1x4s and 1x6s. You're going to end up with probably some boards that are some different widths. Now, that's not really an issue, but we have to understand that that's the way it is. And Depending on what we're making, we may rip things down to fit, or of course we're going to be edge gluing them together to make them wide enough. So keep that in mind as you're doing your work. Now, we can play with this a little bit, okay? We're making cutting boards. There is not a exact correct size for cutting boards. You choose what size you're going to, okay? And the reason that I mention that is, for example, this board is 7.5 inches wide. Well, I do 2 widths of that, and I have 15 inches, which is really too wide for what I want. Well, that's not an issue. I can always trim it down and use that other offcut piece for something else. This, I've got a 7.5 piece and a 5-inch piece. That's 12.5. Well, that's closer to 12 inches, so that makes a lot of sense. A little bit of trimming, it'll work out. Here with my walnut, I'm in a bit of trouble, and the reason I'm in a bit of trouble is that I thought the walnut that I had here in the shop was good. So one of these pieces is 5 1/4, and the other is 4 1/2. Now this 4 1/2 is the one I had to cut the wane off of, okay? And that's why it's so narrow. The other thing I found is I've got a check or crack in the end of this board as well as a knot hole. So my original thought was to make my cutting boards 24 inches. But when I measure the available space here between that knot hole and the check, I've only got 20 inches. Okay, I can live with that. I'll make a 20-inch board, okay? So this board may be a little smaller. It'll only be 20 inches long. So because of that, I'm going to make these a little smaller. So I'm going to end up with cutting boards that are somewhere around 11 by 20 inches. Still a good size, okay? Again, there's no perfect size, so the size you choose is what's going to be. I've made little cutting boards for like cheese boards, okay? I've made big cutting boards that were like 30 inches long by 14 inches wide. I've seen them as much as 18 by like 36. So any size will work. You just pick what's going to work for you. And remember, a little mixing and matching doesn't hurt anything. Matter of fact, we're going to do some mixing and matching because we're going to take the woods from these and interchange them a little to put a little bit of color in there, a little variety in the color. And so I'm going to go to the table saw and I'll cut some strips that allow me to do that. Okay, so I want to cut some thin strips off of my boards, and they're going to be part of the design where I'm going to integrate the other woods into each of the cutting boards. And to make this easier, I'm using a thin rip gauge that I've mounted to my table saw. Now you notice it's mounted here in the track on the right side of the blade, and I've got my fence on the left side of the blade, and that probably looks backwards to you. And for most of us, we're so used to doing it with our fence to the right of the blade that this is backwards. But the reason I've done it is because my miter track on the left side is so far from the blade that the thin rip gauge doesn't reach properly. And what this allows me to do is make repetitive, narrow cuts. It's always better to make your thin cuts on the outside of the blade. And the reason that that is better is because basically what we're doing is we're giving ourselves a safety margin for this side for running the board through, but the other thing it does is it eliminates chatter. You know, you run something through, especially a narrow piece through the table saw, and you get a lot of chatter, the board bouncing up and down. Well, that ends up giving you a bunch of tooth marks in your or blade marks in your wood, which we really don't want either. So by flipping this over and going to this other side and cutting on the outside of the blade, I'm going to get a better cut. That's really what I'm trying to do. Okay. So I'm going to cut some 1/4-inch strips and some 1/2-inch strips out of all these woods so that I can intermix them. I guess I should have mentioned this before cutting, but what the thin rip gauge gives me is a way of knowing how far over to move my fence between cuts. In other words, so like this, I've already made 2 cuts, and you can see there's a gap right here. So if I wanted to make another 1/4-inch cut, what I would do is loosen the fence up, move it over so that this is just touching, and then I can clamp my fence down at that point, and then by doing so, when I make this cut, it'll be a 1/4-inch, just like the other strips that I've made. And I can keep doing that as long as I've got lumber to work with. I'm going to mix it up a little bit though, and I'll cut a couple of 1/2-inch strips. So I've got to readjust my gauge. It's still mounted into the track, and it's got a scale on it, so in both inches and in millimeters, so you can know exactly how far to set it over. So now with that, I can readjust the position of my fence, and this next strip coming off here should be a 1/2 inch wide. Okay, you probably noticed I didn't cut the maple there, and that's because the maple board I'm cutting for is wider than the board I used for the other two types of wood, so I have to reset my fence. Now, since my last cut was a 1/2 inch, that means my first cut here is going to be a 1/2 inch as well. The one problem with gluing up so many boards at one time is having enough clamps. And the way I'm handling that is I'm gluing 3 at a time. Fortunately, my clamps are big enough to allow that. The problem that causes for me is that I've got to really work kind of quick putting them together so the glue doesn't start setting before I've got everything put together. So as you can see, I've interspaced different colors of wood in here, making the pattern like I was talking about. They aren't all lined up the same way. The walnut one, the pieces are most towards the middle, and the one in the cherry, they're most towards the edge, but they don't have to be exactly the same. The idea is we're getting the same theme going, and in doing that, we're saving ourselves some time and effort. So what I'm going to do is move things over a little bit, freeing up some space over here for my cherry pieces, and I'll go ahead and glue those first. And hopefully go quickly. Now I've waxed the tops of my clamps here, my parallel action clamps, and the main reason I did that is to basically make sure the glue doesn't stick, okay? And I've also, as I was laying out the wood, I've looked at the wood to say, which is my better side? Which is the side I want showing? That's an important factor. You always want to go for your best side. Okay, did I turn this one? Yes, I did. Okay, so it's this side that I need to be. We want to make sure we get 100% contact with the glue. Just a stripe down the middle won't do it. We want the glue to squeeze out a little, but not a lot. And I'm going to use a roller to spread the glue because that's the fastest way I know to spread it. I'm using Titebond 2 here because it's a water-resistant glue. Now some people would say, well, why not use Titebond 3? Good question. Really, wood cutting boards should never be submersed, okay? So you really don't need them to be waterproof. It is useful, however, to have them be water-resistant because we're going to be cleaning them, hopefully with just like a damp cloth. And we don't want to soften the glue, okay? Now I actually have a little more glue on here than what I want, but that's okay. Getting my ends lined up as evenly as I can. My cutting boards are a touch on the long side so that I can trim the ends once I get them put together. That's intentional. Okay, so there's the first one. Now we want to make sure we don't glue this seam because this is going to the next board. We'll just set that one up against it. One consideration for this is you want to make sure that you have your saw set up well, mostly the blade being parallel to the fence, or the fence being parallel to the blade actually. And if you've got a blade that's not going to leave a lot of marks on the wood, if you get a lot of marks on the wood, you're going to end up having to joint the edges in order to be able to glue this together. Fortunately, my saw with the blade that's in it, does a pretty darn good job of giving me a very clean edge to work with. I can't say it was always that way. My previous saw would not do that. And I ended up gluing some boards together that had gaps in them, and I had to go back and fix them. Now, a lot of people will try and close up gaps by putting on massive amounts of pressure. If you have to put on massive amounts of pressure to close up gaps, you're doing something wrong. Probably means that your wood is not properly jointed, or that you've got those blade marks I was just referring to. What do you do in that case? Well, you glue it up as best you can. Then if you have to, you take it apart, saw down that bad joint, and glue it together again. A lot of people talk about using sawdust and glue to fill that, and you can do that to some extent. But what I found is most of the time when people are talking about that, they're overdoing it. And you end up with basically a mess. Okay, so there's 2 cutting boards. We're making progress. Now the walnut ends up looking different because walnut is has a much more variety in its coloration than a lot of other woods do, and that's one of the reasons walnut is so popular. This piece of the walnut, we've got some, we're right on the edge there of getting some of the sapwood in there. I remember both of these came from the same board. They're just different ends of the same board. But even this piece, we can see it's darker here and lighter down here. So you get a lot of variety with walnut, which is one of the beautiful things about walnut as a wood. Some people don't like that. I happen to like it. Okay, come here, roller. Rubber rollers are the best for this because they're the easiest to clean up. A plastic roller will work fairly well too. You don't want to be using a metal roller because you'll probably end up getting the metal roller will probably end up rusting, and you'll get some discoloration into the glue. You really don't want to use a wood roller, although I have used wood rollers. They will work. The problem is they're difficult to clean the glue off of. Okay, so again, this seam here, there's no glue there because that's separation between 2 boards. Now you could clamp your boards up individually. I don't have enough clamps to do that, but I buy my clamps. When I buy clamps, I tend to buy the big ones because I know I'm going to end up needing it. Okay, so we've got everything glued. Now we can go ahead and start tightening it up. Now, when you're tightening, I already said you don't need to use gorilla strength on this. What you need to do is just get it snug. So I'm going to go a little bit at a time. And I'm using this caul, my left hand is on, mostly to help hold the pieces down, keep it from buckling. Since I'm using parallel action clamps, that's not a really big issue. Nevertheless, I want to be careful about it. You notice I'm tightening a little bit at a time. Okay. I'm not, and I'm trying to make sure nothing is higher than anything else, although invariably it will be. It's bound to happen. Okay, so everything's pretty flat here. Everything's glued together. And now we gotta wait. So I've left my cutting boards overnight for the glue to dry. And by the way, I had added a couple more bar clamps off camera. So we'll get those off of here first. And then I've got my bigger clamps. I probably didn't need those extra clamps, but I prefer to play it safe. Now, there's a couple things that are always going to have happen when we do an edge glue. One is that our different pieces may not stay exactly level. So we've got to count on, we're going to run it through the planer one more time. Okay. The second thing is that we're going to have glue squeeze out. Now, if you don't have glue squeeze out, there's a really good chance you didn't use enough glue. Okay. I have had glue squeeze out here, and it looks like I actually managed to glue my cutting boards to the clamps. But fortunately, I had waxed the bars of the clamps before, there we go, so I can get it apart. So, got a couple things I need to do here. One is I need to plane these all real lightly just to even them up. But before we do that, I've got glue here, squeeze out here, and probably even worse on the bottom side, that's got to be cleaned off. So we've got to deal with the glue squeeze out in one way or another, and the typical way is to just use a chisel to clean it up, scraping it off. Now, it doesn't have to be off perfectly because we're going to be running this through the planer anyway. But if we don't scrape it off, we're not going to have a level, even surface to work with, okay? Also, all that excess glue could be detrimental to the edge on your planer blades. Now, like I said, a chisel is the normal way of doing this. I've made my own little tool here that is just for this purpose. And it basically, I attach a blade magnetically to a handle. Allows me to scrape this. Less chance of digging into the wood with this than there is just using a chisel. And that's the main reason I made this tool. So of course it's got to be done on all three boards, and it's got to be done on both sides of the boards. Typically you'll have more glue squeeze out on the bottom side than you do on the top. Okay, so I've pretty much got the glue cleaned up on these. Not a perfect, but pretty good. So I can run it through the planer. Now, always assume you're going to have to run them through the planer again, because no matter how careful you are, there's a really good chance that you're going to get slight unevenness coming across where you've got those boards coming together. It's common, okay? Maybe you'll look out sometimes and it won't happen. Like this board's pretty good, but this cherry board down here on the bottom is a little more uneven. So I'm going to go a very light pass on each side, clean that up. But before I do, I notice that my maple board here is more than 12 inches wide. It's 13.5 inches wide, so that's not going to fit through my planer the way it is. I'm going to have to rip it down a little bit because my maximum width on my planer is 12.5 inches. Not an uncommon problem, but that is a limitation to keep in mind. If anyone ever asks you to do a really big board, like a custom board, keep in mind that that width is an issue, okay? If you're going to go wider than the capacity of your planer, that means you're going to have to either hand plane it or plane it with a router and a gantry, and that's still doable, but it's going to be more labor, and you should charge accordingly. Okay, I only took like a 1/64 of an inch off of each side to level these out. And you can see a little burn marks on there. I need to clean the rollers in my planer because it's not feeding through really well right now. But that's all right, I've got to sand this anyway, and I'll be taking those burn marks out in the process. Now, I cut my material to, I believe it was 21 inches in length. Yep, that's what it looks like, because I want to end up with a 20-inch board, okay? And I did that intentionally because you always end up with a little bit of unevenness. Yeah, you can try and defeat that, and for the most part you can, but you won't be perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut one side, and I'm going to flip it, measure it, and cut the other side. Look at your boards before you do this and see, make sure you don't have any place where you've got a little separation on the ends. If it's going to separate anywhere, that's where it'll be. So if you've got like that last ½ inch has got some separation, you may as well cut that off so you don't have to fight with it. So now we've got our 3 cutting boards, and they're all approximately the same size. Now this walnut one's a little narrower, But again, they don't have to be exactly the same. Really what we've got is we've got three boards that are essentially the same, that are made the same, even though there are differences. Now we could have cut these in half and made smaller boards too. If you're going to sell boards at like a local fair or something, you want a variety because you don't know what people are going to buy. Some people are going to want a board this big, some people are going to want a smaller board, some people are going to prefer one type of wood over another, so make sure you've got that variety. We've created some variety here just by our mixing and matching of the woods, and we've saved ourselves a bunch of time. Again, we could have done bigger boards and then cut them up and accomplish the same thing. So we're going to continue with batch working as we finish these up. And that means rounding over the edges, sanding them, and putting a finish on them, okay? Now, as we all know, sanding takes forever. But before we sand, we're going to put a 1/4 inch round over on them. I've got a round over bit in my trim router. 1/4 inch is about the biggest I'll go with a bit in a trim router. Anything bigger than that, I would have to go to a full-size router. It just doesn't really have the power for it. So I'm going to go ahead and do the ends first, because if it's going to split out anywhere, it'll be on the ends, and then do the sides. So I'm going to do all three of them on this end, flip them around, do all three on the end, then one side, then the other side, okay? So let's go ahead and trim these up. I was afraid that was going to happen. Okay, so those are trimmed, and now of course the next step is sanding, which takes half of forever. Unfortunately, you can't make the job faster on that one, but having them together and working from one to the next is more efficient than just doing one board. I'm going to be using a random orbital sander to sand these, and trying to get them done as quickly as I possibly can. I will be going multiple stages though as I'm sanding. I'll start off with 80 grit. Then I'll go to 120, probably 180 is the last thing I'll do. Remember, these are cutting boards. This isn't a fine finish type thing. They're going to get scratched up in use. So how fine do we have to sand it? You know, it's really a personal decision, but I don't see any reason to go beyond 180. Now with our cutting board sanded, we're just ready to put some finish on it. I've gone ahead and gone over these with a tack cloth to get rid of a lot of the dust. There's still a little there, but that really doesn't matter considering it's a cutting board. It'll come off in the natural process of finishing, okay? The best finish for cutting boards is just plain old white mineral oil. It's food safe, and that's the biggest reason for it. Now, whenever you're finishing any surface, you want to finish both sides. I've already finished the bottom side of all these, and then flipped them over, and now I'm going to finish the top side. And one of the nice things about using an oil finish like this is its simplicity itself. You don't have to worry about brush strokes, you don't have to worry about being fancy, just put it on. And you want to put it on kind of heavy because it is going to soak into the wood. You want it to soak into the wood. Don't forget the edges, those are important too. Just like the bottom side, if we don't do the edges, we leave someplace for moisture to get in. So, Now, in reality, this is going to need about 3 coats of finish, okay, maybe 2, but end grain is worse. End grain will soak up a lot more mineral oil than long grain will. I've done end grain cutting boards where I've had to put 4 or 5 coats of oil on there to feel like I actually got enough oil on. You want to basically put the oil on until it seems like it's not soaking in anymore. So a lot depends on how dry your wood is before you even start. I can already see that soaking in there to that piece of maple. I love what the oil does, or what any finish really does to the wood. That's what really makes the grain pop. Now, like I said, I can already see these 2 are drying, so I'm going to go ahead and put some more on without even waiting. We want that finish to soak in, so. And the other thing about this too, if you're selling these, remember to tell people they really need to re-oil them about every 3 months, because the oil will dry. And maybe create a little instruction sheet for how to take care of their cutting board. Things like don't submerge it in the water, you know, and to go ahead and oil it every 3 months. Things like that, so that their cutting board will last. This wood was really dry. It's just soaking this oil up really fast. Okay, so basically those are oiled. Now I've got to let that sit and dry, and then I'll have to give at least 1 more, maybe 2 more coats before I can really call it done. So here are our 3 finished cutting boards, and somebody's bound to ask, so let me answer the question. How do you know when you've put enough coats of oil on it? It's really simple. When the wood stops soaking up the oil, you're there, and then you'll end up having to wipe off the excess and then give it a couple days to dry. I've done 3 coats on these, which was enough. Now, if I had done this with end grain, I'm sure I would have ended up with more coats. Batch building like this will save you a lot of time, not just on cutting boards, but pretty much anything you want to make in your shop that you're trying to make to sell. Do a bunch of them in one step and move on to another step, then move on to another step, rather than doing one all the way through.